Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. I always encourage you to come and meet debut authors on the theory that if you're here, you will have bragging rights forever, right? Just in case they turn into like a bestseller or a critical hit like Juliet, who's just had most wonderful reviews and press for her book. I don't assume there's any connection between you being an editor of a company and you're now being an author, no?
Like nepotism? I don't know.
No, kidding. Whatever. The hilarious part is that the three of us have known each other for years. She's an editor at Soho, which is part of Penguin Random House. Francine, A.A. Stephanie Barron, has published many books with Random House. And now I am an editor at Random House. I mean, it's just really amazing when it's all worked out. Anyhow, that's not the point of the evening. The point of the evening is for Francine, Stephanie, and Juliet to discuss her book and also turn the tables and find out what it's like for an author to grill an editor. I love it. So I'm going to pass cookies around, sit right over here and enjoy it.
I'm so glad all of you joined us tonight because Juliet is one of my favorite people in the world. She is, as Barbara said, my editor on several books. She has edited the most recent two of my Jane Austen mysteries, as well as supervised the revision of my whole Nantucket book series and the two most recent books in that series. The sixth book just having been turned in and coming out in a year. So
It's awesome.
Juliet and I have worked a lot together, and one of the reasons I was so thrilled to find her and have her agree to take me on as a writer is because she actually edits. Those of you who know book publishing won't be surprised to learn that many people in New York in publishing are focused on acquiring books, but not necessarily on actually editing them. They love the chase of getting a hot property. Juliet has experienced this, and I'd love to have her talk about it a little bit because Juliet was the hot property with Stella Fortuna about a year ago, and had a dizzying experience in her sale of her first manuscript.
I'm still pretty dizzy.
Yeah, yeah. But at any rate, what I love about Juliet's editing is that she is extremely thoughtful, highly versed and literate in the canon of English literature, deeply interested in character development, a craftswoman with prose, and all of those qualities that I've experienced as a writer being edited by Juliet are amply in evidence in her first novel, The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna. Fascinatingly, I didn't know when I first started working with Juliet that she was a writer as well. It's unusual, obviously, to wear both hats because they're both so time-consuming, and particularly because Juliet is associate publisher at Soho, which means she is responsible for so much of the running of the company. And so she mentioned at one point, I think we were at a bar, you mentioned that you were finishing your novel, and I was blown away. And then I learned that the woman who is now my editor at Random House, because I have editors at both houses, in fact tried to buy Juliet's book. And so it's that sort of 6 degrees of separation. So Juliet, if you could, I know you've done this quite a bit because I've seen you on video doing this, but if you could explain a bit about your inspiration for Stella Fortuna and how you came to feel compelled to write the book that we have sitting in front of us today.
Sure, and thank you for your very generous introduction. I hope I deserve all that. But so the 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna is a novel about two sisters. When you meet them, they're about 100 years old, and they've been locked in a blood feud for 30 years. And the book purports to go back to the beginning of their lives in a tiny village in southern Italy and unpack what made them go from being best friends to bitter enemies. And so it just tells the 100-year life story of these sisters, their feud, and specifically the main character, Stella, who has really bad luck and lots of near-death experiences. So I come from a very tight-knit Italian-American family. you can see that my parents and baby are here. They traveled from 3 states that are on the East Coast in order to, I guess only 2 states, there's only 3 of them, in order to be here. So we're just a very tribal people. But this is, you know, a lot of Italian families are very, very tight-knit. And my grandmother was, in fact, an immigrant. She came over in the 1930s when she was a teenager. And the core relationship of the 2 sisters is inspired by her and her sister, who were very involved in my childhood. They took care of me when my parents were working when I was really little, before I went to kindergarten, and they were just a huge part of my life. And my grandmother, when I was 5 years old, had a brain injury that ended in a life-saving lobotomy, and she did live an additional 30 years after the lobotomy, but it completely changed her personality and caused this terrible feud with her sister that no one ever understood. And I kind of used that heartbreaking family schism as a jumping off point to try to unpack the Italian-American story, the immigrant story. I was really fascinated by the region of southern Italy that they came from, Calabria, which I found very difficult to read about because there's not a ton written about it. So I really wanted to put something down in text for other people who wanted to know more. To tell the story, to kind of collect some of the lore of other immigrant families who had come over and lived in the Hartford area where my family settled. So those were my 2 aims. 1, to try to represent Calabria and the immigrant experience, and 2, to kind of honor my grandmother and the lost person she was before this accident that completely changed her personality.
Well, that leads me to a question that's been kind of haunting me as I've read the book, and that is how closely your fictional account hews to the actual events in Stella's life, which I know was not your grandmother's name, but for sake of simplicity, let's call her Stella.
Yeah, sure. The biggest problem for me in writing this book, I've told many writers who I've worked with as an editor, you know, when you hit a wall with your story, follow the character will get you through, and you should write from character to plot and not the other way around. And in this case, trying to follow the beats of my grandmother's life story and make things hit like the facts actually happen was so hard because I didn't understand the character. My grandmother was a cipher to me. She had her frontal lobe removed, and a third of it, not the whole thing. And so I had to basically decide what bits of her actual life I could use and actually understand why they happened. In the end, that ended up being the 8 near-death experiences. So those are all fact. My grandmother had 8 near-death experiences. Everything in between those deaths is fiction. And especially the character of Stella is completely fictitious because I don't know who my grandmother was as a young woman. The memory is lost or eroded by the 30 years that followed the accident, in which she was a person who needed to be cared for and a burden. Although we loved her and took care of her, and my family did an amazing job keeping her alive and taking care of her during that time, still you forget, So the deaths are real and the rest is completely invented.
Okay, so that leads me to a question because, having written myself about people who actually lived, which I do a great deal in my work, most recently about Jenny Churchill, Winston Churchill's mother, there's always a moment where you have to step across a sort of line in the sand, which is what you know about the character and then what you decide to own and create about the character to make that actual person your functioning guide through a story arc. And for me, I've always had to find a moment where I can identify a vulnerability in the person. And usually it's in childhood. It's a moment that scars them or defines them and slightly bends the nature of their personality as they move forward their life, and that gives me a handle on them as a character.
That sounds very realistic to me.
Yeah, well, I'm interested because you know about the 8 deaths, right? Or near deaths, right?
Yep.
And yet you say very little about who she was.
Yeah.
And yet the character of Stella in the book is such a strong woman. And she's strong against the backdrop of everyone around her. She has a distinctly defined personality where her mother, her sisters, her brothers, her father seem to fall into more generalized patterns. Not that they aren't distinct characters, but you know, her sister, who's so close to her, is a very biddable girl. You know, she's not particularly shown as brilliant, so she doesn't strike out on her own. She's a follower more. But Stella is such a distinct persona that I felt like this was your grandmother. So I'm interested in the choices you made and how you made them to create that person out of what you said, suggest as kind of a void.
Part of it was imagining, but I have to be honest with you, I've never felt like a very creative person. I don't think I'm good at coming up with things from scratch. And at heart, I am a sort of history major type, and when I was really at a loss for why a thing would have happened in the plot, like I knew she had to do X, Y, or Z, and I started digging for her emotional reasons for doing it, my solace was usually research. And I would, the more I read about topics, the more I would find the kind of arcane points, especially about women's lives that don't always make history books, that would have vastly affected a day-to-day scenario. So, so that's basically what I did.
Like what? In Stella's case.
Yeah, oh my God, there's so many. No, I should have had an example ready for you.
It's a chest.
I know. So, when I was probably in 4th grade, my grandmother, who had this lobotomy, came to my school to talk to my class about her immigration process. We were talking about where we had come from, and she gets up in front of the class, and my mother had come with us to translate in case my grandmother, who was then, you could get very confused in case she spoke the wrong language. And in front of the class, my grandmother starts talking about worms. And my teacher, we redirected her because it didn't make any sense. It was incoherent, and we talked about more like things like going to Napoli to catch the boat and the Statue of Liberty and seeing New York Harbor and all that. And when we got home, my mom's like, "Ma, what are you talking about? Worms? What was that?" And my grandmother goes, "Oh, Bacco da Sette. You wanted to ask me about what my life was like in Italy, so it was the silkworms." And we're all like, "What? Silkworms? That's silkworms. Silk is from China. Everyone knows that." And so then my mother went and asked my great aunt, my grandmother's sister, who had not had an accident, and was like, "What's mommy saying about silkworms?" And Aunt Con's like, "Oh yeah, when we were little, it was our only source of income. So we raised silkworms all summer long." And this is just a totally lost art, because after World War II, it all went to the factories in the north. But when you these remote villages in Calabria especially, but other parts of the south of Italy, peddlers would come up to the mountain villages. They would sell these pouches of eggs, which women would tie under their dresses, basically against their own bosoms to hatch. And then when the eggs hatched, they would spend 24 hours a day for the life cycle of the worm, which is about 5 weeks, doing nothing but feeding them mulberry leaves that had to be harvested. I mean, it's a very demanding process that takes up a month of the year. So, and this is how they saved up money to buy their trousseaux, which was the only thing that they ever had in their life. They're not allowed to own land, because only men can own land. Women are not citizens, so they can't have bank accounts or income or anything like that. They can only work for in-kind payment, like a bottle of olive oil. But suddenly, when you understand that probably all of the women in this village during the month of July are operating in a kind of fever trance of sleeplessness because they're trying to make their income for the year, it makes it much more likely that you might have a near fatal accident where you're not watching your kid, and they get into something like boiling oil in an eggplant pan or whatever the thing is. I mean, this is just one kind of extreme example, but the more I learned about life and these little tiny details, the more the plot kind of organically clicked into place. There's usually a historical explanation for why something weird happened. You just have to keep digging,
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you. I think it's always been the research that has both compelled me to write a story. Usually I'm interested in something and I start reading about it, and then I start peeling back the layers of the onion, and then I find the story that is calling me to write it. And that's the great gift of loving history, I think, and having roots.
This is why we like each other.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Okay, so Stella, the arc of the story is fundamentally that Stella's childhood in Italy is then radically changed by emigrating to New York, to Hartford, Connecticut, and her immersion in American culture. So you've woven that against a backdrop. I don't want to be a spoiler here, but a somewhat tortured romance. And I was curious about your choices with that.
Mm-hmm.
So you created a problem within Stella, and is that rooted in family history? Is it purely your fantasy, or?
That was an invention. But that was one of those things that came out of asking myself why. I knew I had to get her from point A to point B, and the deeper I dug into her character, Stella's character, the more I understood about her attitude toward marriage and romance and sex specifically. Yeah. So I know I would love to say more, but I don't want to spoil. So let me self-censor a little bit here. I think that if you're growing up in the world Stella is, which is the 1920s, in extreme Catholic patriarchy, where it's not the modern Catholic Church, and it's also the Southern Italian Catholic Church had been deeply affected by 400 years of Spanish colonialism, which was extremely exploitative. And I mean, so the church is not just the church that we think of. There's also the fact that they own 80% of the land. So most people are essential feudal slaves working for the church, albeit through a middleman who collects a fee. Things like sex and social mores become so binding and grinding, and like there is no freedom anywhere you go. You don't have the power to work for yourself, never mind anything else. And I think you get a system where men are yes, they're empowered over they own their wives and their children. The wives have no personhood, as I mentioned, but the men also own nothing else. You know, they go and they toil for 16 hours a day in these miserable conditions, and often at the end of the year don't have enough money left over to pay for malaria medicine for their children. So, you know, there's just misery on every side because of this very exploitative system developed under the Spanish rule. And so if you're a very, very good man, you maybe survive that by continuing to be a good father and husband. But if you have any, say, personality damage done by 4 years of terrifying war experience that may have induced PTSD or other miseries or any other number of hardships that befell this generation, you may go home and take out your anger and displeasure on your wife. And so I think that you will see is a lot of demented family structures within this. Even, you know, people you want to believe are good, but they're exploited by the system, and then so they turn around and exploit, and it creates I think if you're a woman who has absolutely no power in this situation except over her own sexuality, that's the one thing you get to hold on to. So, you know, Stella basically sees her path toward freedom is in not ever having to subject herself to a man. And that was very much born out of the time and place as well as her own personality.
Yeah. My family background is Irish Catholic, and I recognize that my parents, who were born in 1915 and 1918 respectively, grew up in a very different world pre-World War II when they met and married than I certainly did, or my sisters. So I find that fascinating because you chose in writing this book to insert yourself as a narrator. So the book feels very much as though it bridges both fact and fiction. It is fiction, but at certain moments Juliet pulls back and says, now you realize, and she'll explain something to the reader in conscious way that allows us to feel as though you are the granddaughter in the story, which to a degree you are, but also that you are our guide to this world, which you've mapped. So there's a huge contrast between the world of Hartford, which you knew firsthand, of course, and the world of Calabria. And I gather you did go?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I did. So I'm a nerd, a history nerd, as I've mentioned, and I did a ton of book research. I actually wrote the second half of the book first because I felt like I knew it well enough. And meanwhile, I was just reading everything
Meaning
I could
Hartford.
get. Yeah,
Hartford.
yeah. After immigration on, I was reading everything I could find about Calabria, or more generally the South. I was reading in English and Italian, which I had to learn for this project. I grew up with dialect spoken in my family, but I really had to make a project out of learning it to get there. And there's just so little written history, so I did my best.
Calabrian.
Yeah, about Calabria. Yeah, I mean, so because of the Spanish colonialism, it was essentially an illiterate region until the 1920s. So there's no like own voices movement there. You know, there's no one writing their own story about Calabria until recently, and now people only write about the mob, which is a shame because there's a lot of other stories and heroism and personal drama and things. There's a lot of culture there. So I got what I could out of books, but ultimately the real research was in going back to my grandmother's village, and I took a leave of absence from work, and I lived there in the house she grew up in, which is now owned by a second cousin who was a retired postman.
That's really useful.
It was really neat. The first time I met him, I was kind of on an exploratory little vacation trip, and he was like, "Oh, this is your house too. You must come and live here for a minimum of 1 month." And I was like, "Okay." And I did. But he meant it. It was great. So he and his wife, he figured out kind of early in my stay that he knew a lot of proverbs. And I was very charmed by this. And I learned through him that proverbs are actually a huge part of Calabrese culture. It's a pretty dark history, and it's their way of making everything funny. So he would take me around. We'd be meeting people, collecting, oral histories. I had my tape recorder. I'd go on interviews with old people. But the first thing before we sit down for an interview, he'd be like, "Tell me your favorite proverbs." And I would write them down in my little notebook. And so by the end of the stay, I had about 130, and I only got to use 12 in the book. But I'm saving those others.
Okay, well, I want you to trot out a few here.
Oh yeah, okay. So one of my I have so many favorites, but "O lupo verde ubilu manoluvicu," which means
Oh, I love that one.
yeah, basically the old wolf loses his fur, but not his wiles, which I think is great. And another one that's very popular that is either funny or not funny, depending on how you're interpreting it, is "Kipoe na vutikiene o mulher embriac," which means which do you want, the full bottle of wine or the drunk wife?
Oh man, what a choice.
Yeah. So I mean, so these are really important kind of cultural, sociological research things that I got that informed the text a lot. I learned a lot about Calabre's character from them, but it was hard to actually work them in. And I think there were other kind of sociological research points that were running through the back of my head as I was writing that I got from this trip. That one of them was folk songs, which were so important to me. I learned so much folk music while I was there, and
Which is a theme in the book.
it is a theme in the book, but it was hard. You can't write everything in. There's actually only one song that's represented in the text, which is kind of like the Calabrese national anthem. I as I call it, it's called Calabrizella Mia, which means my beautiful Calabrese girl. And it for me, it became, when I discovered it, it so matched the theme of the book, and then also the tune it just got stuck. So it wrote itself through the text. Can I sing a little bit?
Please
Okay.
sing a little bit.
So it's a story about a young man who he's at his village well, and he falls in love with this beautiful village girl, and but she never loves him back. So that's the whole. There are 3 verses, but the first verse, he's watching her hang her laundry, and he steals her most beautiful handkerchief, which he's gonna keep with him. So let me see. I hope I don't forget the words, but it goes.
Nina tivita l'acqua chi lavavi e il lume cori si inchiuda muri mentre le pagnala si palampravi Yutta rubai lume giumugaturi Calabrisella mia, Calabrisella mia, Calabrisella mia, facciamo amori. Tira l'uleru la la, sta Calabrisella morire mi fa. Tira l'uleru la la, sta Calabrisella morire mi fa.
I think we should mention your mother.
I had plans in the audience.
Always important to have a plant in the audience. Well, I have to commend you because part of the time that I was reading 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna, I was actually listening to it on Audible.
Oh.
And the narrator, of course, does not know how to sing that song.
Oh.
So, yeah. But it's in your rendering, it's quite lovely. It's fascinating to me to hear the difference in Italian and Calabrese.
Yeah, they're very different
Very
languages.
different.
Yeah, it's called a dialect, but I think that's disrespectful just because it's not a written language. It's a language. It's full of ancient and so classical and Byzantine Greek. There's a ton of Arabic. There is a ton of Albanian, and then of course Spanish. And like one of my favorite examples here is sherbet. The word sherbet in English, which I remember when I was little and like first learning the Italian word was sorbetto, and I was like, oh, sherbet is a kind of a bastardization of sorbet. Sorbet is correct. The Italian word is sciubetta, and its origins are from the 8th or 9th century, from the Arab word which means shaved ice. So sciubetta in Calabrese way predates sorbetto, which doesn't occur in Italian until hundreds of years later. So yeah.
Fascinating. Because when you think about, just the sort of Italian neighborhoods of major urban centers in the United States, the sort of Italian shaped ice thing is ubiquitous.
Yeah.
And yet, that's fascinating.
Well,
Okay. Your choice to insert yourself as a narrator. I want to get back to that. I'm curious about your thinking on that and why you felt it was important to frame the book with your voice.
Because Francine, we can't all do what you do, and I have the very, very highest respect for actual historical fiction writers, because what you have to do is pick your period and your theme and then stick with it and actually tell the story staying within the rules of that time period. And I just couldn't do it because there were so many things I wanted to say that would not have been native to Stella's point of view. So I did try to write this in first person from Stella's point of view at one point, and I realized I was leaving so much in the kind of margins of the text that was making me angry to leave out. So
it's fascinating.
So a very fictional modern narrator began to interpolate, and I just let her stay.
Interesting. Okay.
I don't have your discipline, is what I'm saying.
No. I think that one of the hidden aspects of writing, which is well known to both writers and editors, so you now have it from both sides, is the need to frame the story by editing the arc of the story. And that's a complicated way of just saying you have to pick your moments in life if you're writing about someone who actually lived or a character who you want to exemplify a period of time. You have to find the peak moments in a life and consider what they exemplify about a time that you're trying to tell a story in, and then create the narrative in a compelling way among those points of time. And it's particularly difficult when someone lives a long life. And in the past, I've chosen at times to just only consider 20 years or 20 years with flashbacks or 6 months of a life or 3 weeks of a life. And that's a conscious choice that then dictates, you know, your the guide you're giving your reader and the landscape that they're traveling. And you chose to actually do an entire life. And in fact, you start with Stella's sister of the same name who dies as an infant. So we actually get the pre-life. Did you ever consider framing it differently?
No. I did have at different times, you told me, you just said that you didn't know I was writing when we first met, and I was really gun-shy about confessing to anyone in my publishing life or wider life that I was writing, because if it didn't go well, I thought it would be not only embarrassing for me, but also maybe reflect poorly on my career as an editor. I don't know. But during the kind of tortured years of writing this particular book, because I think all the years of writing any book are tortured, but in this specific situation, I had some beta readers and even an early agent read who I sent it to the person I thought would most like it, and then she didn't like it, so I just didn't show it to anyone else for about 2 years. I hid it in its drawer. I know, oh man, but she said to me that you know, the book was like the format completely didn't work, and that I needed to do some real soul searching to figure out what book I actually wanted to write was, because this was not a novel. And that it should, you know, be half the length, and that there should be a romantic arc and things like that. And after 2 years, I decided I didn't want to listen to her, and I went in a different direction. But I mean, I heard that so many times, or I heard something like that so many times, that this needs to be more of something else.
Okay, so that begs the question, Juliet, because you are an editor.
Yeah.
So what you were hearing was publishing's conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
About how you structure a story.
Yep.
And yet you as an editor apparently fought that. And that's interesting.
I think now, in retrospect, and I should have known better, I've been in publishing for 15 years, but I think that, and I apologize to a really excellent agent who's sitting in the audience, because I don't think this applies to him, and he's wonderful. But I think a lot of agents are looking for things. Agents they only make 15% of the sale. So often they're looking for things that remind them of books that have already done well. And so if you're doing something very different, it becomes harder to see how you're going to position it. But I think editors, on the flip side, are very bored by seeing the same thing over and over again. So in fact, they wanted the thing that didn't remind them of what they'd seen before. So my general advice to people who are aspiring authors is don't give up. And I think the agent search is probably the most difficult time. I mean, it was certainly the most difficult piece of my publication process. But I think that's probably the case for many, many people. And I also think that if you know what your book is, you should trust yourself. And if it turns out that your book is only for 5 people, that's fine.
Wow. I'm sorry, that goes against everything that any writer is told on a daily basis.
Yeah, but yeah. I'm sorry, now I'm gonna be in my editor hat mode. But I just, when I edit authors, my general, I get their manuscripts, I give them some suggestions on what I think could make their story better, but I hope I never tell them that they're telling the wrong story or that they're telling it in the wrong way. And if that does happen, I wonder if maybe we shouldn't be working together because we don't have a similar vision for the book.
Well, I was going to say, I imagine there are times when you don't have to say they're telling the story in the wrong way or they're telling the wrong story, you just don't buy the book, right? I'm not talking about authors that you have in your stable, but you know, submissions,
But also, I don't have the arrogance to think that what I like to read is what everyone likes to read or is objectively correct. So, I think that this is why we're surrounded by so many different genres right now. There are readers who are looking for different things. And I think that if you're a writer, you kind of have to stick to your guns about what you want to say. So I knew what I wanted to say. I think I got off point from what your original question was, but that's,
No. I think you answered it. I was really asking how you as an editor who probably has to submit to market considerations with one hat, how you were willing to buck market considerations to a certain degree in writing your own book. because
I'm never willing to submit to market considerations, which is maybe why I work at an independent press and not in a big house. I don't think I can't. I as a reader, I don't want to read things that remind me of other things, and so yeah, I think everyone should be free to follow their hearts. Thank you.
the counterpoint to this is that most large publishing houses are governed actually by not editing, but their marketing
Bottom line,
departments.
yes, that's true.
And
That's
the marketing departments are focused on whether you have a platform on social networks that you can use to promote your books.
That's true.
They're obsessed with that, and your reach, your followers, it's all done by the writers now, and so it's highly unusual and you generally only find that in a smaller house. The willingness to let writers fly their free flags and follow their hearts. So, last question from me, and then we'll open it up to folks in the audience. What are you thinking you might focus on next, if anything? Besides Carlos, the beautiful baby over there.
In my research for this book, I found that villages are so remote and disconnected in Calabria during this period that you could find all this really interesting information about another Calabrese village that has absolutely nothing to do with the world you're writing about, which was both a great disappointment because I found some amazing content and also an inspiration for a next book. So that's what I'm at. As you may know, I'm a crime fiction editor at Soho, and that's what brings me here today, really that connection. So I really wanted to try to write a crime novel. After carefully studying the form for 10 years, so we'll see if I can pull it off. It's really hard to plot responsibly. I feel bad for all of you people now. I have great empathy. So what I'm writing is a book set in 1960 in the very, very deep south of Calabria. There is a mountain range called the Aspromonte Mountains, which is home to the 'Ndrangheta, which is the Calabrese mob, and they are.
Could you repeat that word?
Yes, 'Ndrangheta. It's spelled apostrophe Ndrangheta. So I can write it down for you later, but they are one of the largest and most heinous criminal syndicates in the world, and they've really flown under the radar. People know Cosa Nostra, they know the Neapolitan Camorra, but they don't know how awful these people are. But anyway, it grew out of bandit culture in the 1890s in these mountain villages where there's just tons of secrecy and kind of this spirit of rebellion against the oppressive overlords. And so I wanted to write about organized crime, and I also wanted to write about so many things, but I'll leave it at that. But I will tell you, once I get started, I should leave time for other people's questions. But what I will say is that I did drag my very good sport mother on a 2.5-week exploratory region of these mafia villages in Calabria in the summer of 2017. So if anyone has questions for us after the program, you should just take her aside. She will tell anyone anything they want to know. She's very truthful. So.
Okay, wonderful. I would like to throw it open to all of you. Any questions you might have for either of us. I will repeat each question just to get it on tape, okay? Is that possible?
That sounds great. So. Room is full of writers, come on.
Mine's not a question. I'm just happy that you didn't go with formulary because I loved how you formatted it. You drew me in from the preface, from the very beginning. And I'm from a very close-knit Italian family too. So just you talking about your aunts getting mad if you don't have seconds or thirds, that was my life too.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
So it was nice to relate to something that was my culture. So
Thank you. That's wonderful.
Yes.
Question. You were talking about being at a small press and going to a big one. Echo was a big one at HarperCollins. How did you feel being edited by somebody else as an editor yourself?
How did you feel being edited by someone else as an editor yourself?
Well, first I will say about Echo, They're an imprint of HarperCollins, but they've only been an imprint since 1999. They were founded as an independent press in 1971, and the guy who founded it, Dan Halpern, is still running it. And they are as kooky and dysfunctional as all of the great small presses I've had the privilege of working at. So like when I went in for my meeting with my editor, she wasn't there alone. She had brought like 3 other ladies from different departments, and they're all sitting there and they're asking me very personal questions. I just felt like I was at home at Soho Press. I was like, I see how these people work. So we're at the big publisher, we're at HarperCollins, but I felt like the small press experience. So I really liked that about them. But specifically to being edited, I have 2 kinds of authors I work with. I'm going to call them column A author and column B author. And Francine is definitely a column A author, I'll just say that, but I won't mention any names.
Because A is better than B.
Yes, as type A's, both. So column A author gets my column A author gets my editorial memo, which may be correct or misguided or anger making. I have no idea. And their response is like, "Dear Juliet, thank you so much for taking so much time and energy to think about this so thoughtfully. You've really brought up some fascinating points. I'm so grateful for all of this work that you've done." And then when they say something like, "I'm not going to take your edit,"
I'll have it back to you in 2 days.
Okay, no, that's column A plus right there. But that's one response. So when they then go on to not take my advice, I'm like, "Oh, ain't they sweet? That's fine. I get it. It's their book." Then there's column B author who's like, "You clearly didn't get anything I was going for. If you had only read, or what is going on here is blah, 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 and if you were just a little bit smarter, not so stupid about blah, blah, blah." And then you're like, okay. So when then they don't take your edit, you're like, "Well, I tried to help so-and-so." So when my editor sent me notes and I wanted to behave in the manner of column B, I instead channeled the column A author and wrote, "Thank you so much for this incredible feedback."
Not going to disregard.
But she was actually just so classy and graceful, and so after the first round, she wanted me to make a very drastic change that I didn't want to make. So I wrote her a long essay about why I wasn't going to make it, and then and thanking her really politely. And she wrote back and she's like, "Oh, thank you so much for this really excellent explanation. I'm going to push you on this." So then I did it, and she won.
My favorite editing comment from a book, good 15 years ago, was the 3rd draft I had sent to this particular editor, and she responded, she goes, yes, you finally got it, but the book, you should know, begins on your page 200. Everything up to page 200, just throw away. And she was absolutely right, and my 4th draft was the one that was published. So I value editing, and I don't know what your experience was, but for me, all of my writing requires a dialogue with someone that I trust, and it's not a critique group for me. I've never been able to endure critique groups because of the partial nature of how you give them pages.
Yeah.
They never get the full, and they can respond to the short snippet you've given them once a month or once whatever, and love it, but not have any sense of continuity or coherence in the plot because they can't see it. So I find it less than useful, but having a relationship with a great editor is critical for me because I trust that person and I want to create a hybrid of a book that I think is good, that the editor perceives could be better, and achieve that end. And that is something that I've always striven to do with my editing relationships. Did you feel that it was onerous, or did you feel it was actually beneficial in the long run?
No, it was really good. I had a problem that I knew was there, and I hadn't figured out the way to correct it. And she suggested a way to correct it that made me very uncomfortable, and that's the one I turned down. And when she pushed me again, she suggested a different, completely different way in that I had never seen, and I just like. It was really great to have. She must have read the thing cover to cover at least 6 times during that process, and that bandwidth and stamina is really important. I think.
And a lot of people don't have.
Yeah, a lot of people don't have the stamina to go back to a text again and again, and I do because that's what I do professionally. But
you mean as a writer you do because
yes,
that's what you do
Yeah, but part of me was counting on not having that experience with an editor, so I thought I had done it enough on my own, and it never is. I don't think.
Never is. Other questions, folks? Yes, sir.
So, I have a question for you about how you balance your writing routine with your day job, because you have a day job that involves staring at the page for hours on end, and then you're writing this very involved book that also involves staring at the page for hours on end. So how did you stack these things together? How did you pace yourself? How do you keep from burning out?
I don't know if I can say that I did keep myself from burning out, but I definitely found I couldn't write while I was editing. So if I was in an editorial period, I would just edit, and then I would say I'm taking 5 weeks off. I'm only doing admin, board campaigns, and business maintenance for 5 weeks, and then I would do 2 hours in the morning, every morning before work. I'd get up at 5:30 and work until 7:30. And I could be pretty disciplined about that, and then I tried to do a few makeup days on weekends, and so that was it, in clumps like that. You just have a calendar on the wall, and you only get credit for that day if you finish your goal, and then I only get to use my highlighter pen to cross off that day if I get my credit. So that's it. Just like
And
Trixie.
meanwhile, she was pregnant and having a child.
Right.
So.
And now she has the child.
And I have the child,
Which is
which
even
is
better.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No, it's. I don't recommend doing all those things at once. I don't regret my choices, but I don't necessarily remember the last 18 months.
You mentioned the going to, or did you in the book talk about Ellis Island to some extent?
Not really.
No, Ellis Island didn't come up in the book. My characters don't go through Ellis Island because of the timing. But I went to Ellis Island, and I recommend it to everyone, even if you didn't have family who went through there, because it is so powerful, and the museum is so well done, and it just really, standing in that hallway and thinking about people waiting, and the idea of this incredible voyage that they have just undergone, that they may be turned back away from. It's very a physical experience, and I think it's really wonderful and helps bring things to life. And one of my inspirations right before I started writing this draft was I saw Toni Morrison do an event for the book Mercy, which is not one of her more popular books, but is one that I used as a touchstone in my mind. It's set in the year 1699 in Virginia, and there are 16 chapters. It's very short, and each chapter is a different person who is living in this wild land of this settlement in Virginia, and there's someone from every not every extant racial group, but they're all from 16 different racial populations, and so you see kind of what everyone's experience was. And Toni Morrison said, when she was talking about it, her inspiration for writing the book was going to a similar museum, an immigration museum in England, in Devon, or Cornwall, rather, and it was an embarkation point for mail order brides back in the 17th century, where these women would basically see these write-ups from newspapers that, man is looking for a woman who can, good childbearing age, can cook, or whatever the things are. And so she would get on a boat, she would take the fee because her passage would be paid, and she'd go marry someone who might be a serial killer, or who might have smallpox, or, who might be dead when she got there because his plantation had burned down, whatever the thing was. And she actually only had a 2 in 3 chance of surviving the boat voyage anyway. And Toni Morrison said she went to this museum and she imbibed this space, and she thought about the desperation that would make you be the woman to get on that boat. Like, say, we have a 1 in 3 chance of dying before you even go off to marry this maybe serial killer. And I just, so I thought that was incredible. It's just to think about what has brought people to America, and it's a privilege to be able to follow one story and depict it for a mass audience, and it made me think about so many other people's stories. So Ellis Island, I recommend.
Sir.
This may be a little naive question, perhaps, but some authors write under a pseudonym and some write under their own name. How do you decide how you want to do that?
I think the reason a lot of authors write under pseudonyms now is more to do with what we call metadata, which is basically discoverability on the internet. So if you have a name that other people have, it makes it harder for people to find your unique work, and so that's why I think most people write under pseudonyms, although you have different reasons for writing under pseudonyms. But that I didn't have that reason because I have a name that's a Google whack right now. So there's no other Juliet Grameses that I've ever known. So I didn't have to do that, and in fact, it makes it easier to find my book because my name is unusual. So, or sort of unusual. But you should talk about why you write under pseudonyms.
I have the reverse problem because there is a Stephanie Barron who is a curator at the LA Museum of Art and publishes all the time in art history and is very visible at fundraisers and yada yada yada, and I'm constantly being confused with her to the extent that even on Amazon they will list some of her books under my author name on my author page, and I have to tell them that we're different people. She seems less concerned with it than I am. But people will write I'll get emails saying, your book on, I don't even know what, but it's like degenerate art under Hitler, and I'm like, no, that's not me, but it's spelled exactly the same way, and I can't help it. I had to choose a pseudonym when I started my Jane Austen mysteries because I sold them to a different publisher than had published my Francine Mathews books. And so most publishers will not cross market for another publisher. And so my Francine Mathews books have been at William Morrow, and they were distinct from Bantam, which bought the Janes. And then eventually they acquired the Francine Mathews books since they were publishing both of them, but I already had these two names. So I have kind of used that, and it is all my name. My full name is Francine Stephanie Barron Mathews, so it's very simple for me to keep straight. But I have followed that path, and over the course of 28 books now, I have kind of made the Mathews books the more contemporary or gritty or more violent or more dark books, whereas the Stephanie Barron books tend to be more literary in their roots, or historical fiction, or women's fiction. So that's and some people read both, but for those who don't, it helps to clarify what they're getting.
Yeah, well, that was Ruth Brindle's reason for taking a second name. Barbara Vine. Her books were different. Elizabeth Peters, who actually had 3 names, did. So sometimes it is to define what you're writing.
Genres almost, yes.
I have a question,
Yes.
which is, do you feel that your publication now, successful publication as an author, is going to affect your relationship with your authors? For good or for ill?
Wow.
Because we all envy you so
I don't
wasn't adding
know.
that part.
I haven't had to encounter
You haven't had
that
time
yet. Well, I've been on leave since the book came out, so I haven't really had to. But the glamour will fade next week when I go back to work and have to edit a book. So we'll see if the author who's about to get edited will still take my advice. I don't know. Ask me again in 2 months.
What are you thinking of, Barbara?
Well, I took your point, that not many people edit and also are authors. It's actually 2 different kind of mindsets. So I'm wondering if yours may, in fact, alter as an editor now that you are an author, and if that will then make you a different kind of editor.
Weirdly, at Soho, there are 3 editors, and all 3 of us are published authors, and our boss, the publisher, is a published author.
That's the really weird one. Yeah.
So we do have a slightly different culture.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will say my authors have been so supportive so far. I'm really grateful to them. They've been really, really good. Really good. Some in particular have really been amazing. Like readers and publicists, and so.
How wasn't actually anticipating a dark side. I was in case you thought I was.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So Francine, what are you doing next?
I just turned in a book, as I mentioned to Juliet, a month ago? Yeah. Which is out in a year, and it's called Death on Tucker Nook.
It's really good. It's really, really good.
It's one of my Nantucket mysteries set during a hurricane. So that's that. And I'm in the middle of exploring a project that I don't want to talk about yet, I'm afraid, because it involves another person. So I would love to know who owns this pup.
It belongs to Pat up in front. This is Paul the dog. Otherwise
yeah.
known as our bookstore. That's what we call him, Paul the dog.
Paul the dog.
Paul the dog.
Fabulous.
He's a very well behaved canine.
Yeah, I'm missing my own, so.
Indeed.
Okay. Well, you
Shall
want to
we-
sign some books?
Shall we say thank
Julia?
you?
Yes.
Thank you all
That's
so
wonderful.
much. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you.